In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University ran an experiment. He wanted to answer one question. The question was simple. He asked, would an ordinary person, not a criminal, not a soldier, not someone with a history of violence, would an ordinary person hurt a stranger if someone in a position of authority told them to? He expected the answer to be no. He expected that human conscience would resist, that decency would win, that the ordinary person would push back, refuse, walk out. He was wrong. 65% of participants administered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to a stranger. Not because they wanted to, not because they were angry, because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. That number has been replicated across dozens of countries, across 6 decades, across every culture that has tested it. It does not change. 65%. And here is what I need you to understand before I tell you how this happened, before I show you exactly what these people were thinking as they turned the dial, before I show you the transcripts, the actual words, of people administering what they believed was 450 volts to a screaming human being. The people in that room were not monsters. They were people like you. And the experiment isn't over. The year is 1961. New Haven, Connecticut. Yale University. Stanley Milgram is 37 years old, an assistant professor of psychology. He is the son of Jewish immigrants. He grew up watching the Nuremberg trials. He has one question that will not leave him alone. How did it happen? How did ordinary German citizens, school teachers, factory workers, postal workers, people with children and gardens and Sunday routines, how did they participate in the systematic murder of 6 million people? The answer the world had given itself was comfortable. It was, they were different, they were German, something in their culture, their history, their obedience to authority, something that couldn't happen here. Milgram was not convinced. I want you to hold a question for the next 15 minutes, not the question of what those German citizens did, the question of what you would have done. Don't answer it yet. I'll come back to it. Milgram designed a study. He placed an ad in the New Haven newspaper. He offered $4.50 to anyone who would participate in what he described as a study on memory and learning. 780 people responded over the course of his research. They were teachers, accountants, engineers, factory workers, salesmen, ordinary. Each participant arrived at the Yale laboratory and was introduced to another person, a friendly, mild-mannered man in his late 40s named Wallace. They were told they would draw lots to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The draw was rigged. The participant was always the teacher. Wallace was always the learner. Wallace was an actor. The teacher was then taken to a separate room, sat in front of a large machine, and given instructions. The machine had a row of switches. Each switch was labeled with a voltage: 15 volts, 30 volts, 45, up through 150, 200, 275, 345, 405, and at the far end of the panel, past the labels marked danger, severe shock, 450 volts. The last 2 switches were simply labeled XXX. The teacher was told, when the learner in the next room answers a question incorrectly, you will administer a shock. With each wrong answer, you will increase the voltage by 15 volts. Then an experimenter in a gray lab coat sat down behind the teacher, clipboard in hand, and the test began. At 75 volts, the learner in the next room made a sound, a grunt, barely audible. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, he began begging to be let out. He said he had a heart condition. He said he refused to continue. He demanded to be released. Each time the teacher hesitated, the experimenter in the gray lab coat said, "One of 4 things, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." That was all. No threats, no punishment, no consequences for stopping. Just 4 sentences and a gray lab coat. At 300 volts, the learner stopped responding entirely. The room next door went silent. The teacher turned to the experimenter. "What does it mean if he stops answering?" The experimenter said, "Treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer. Continue." And they continued. Most of them continued. Past 300. Past 360. Past 400. All the way to 450 volts. To the switches marked XXX, pressing them into silence. Milgram had predicted that 1% of participants, at most 1%, would go to the maximum voltage. Psychiatrists he consulted before the experiment agreed. 1%, maybe 2%. The pathological fringe, the sadists, the broken ones, 65%. 26 out of 40 in the first study. Not one of the 40 refused to go past 300 volts. Every single participant pressed switches they believed were causing serious harm. The only question was how far they would go. I want to tell you what these people looked like while they were doing it, because this is the part that Milgram's textbook summary never quite captures. This is the part that changes the meaning of the number. They were not calm. They were not indifferent. They were not enjoying it. They were sweating. Their hands were shaking. They laughed, a strange, involuntary laughter that Milgram described as near hysteria. Some begged the experimenter to stop the experiment. Some wept. Some turned to the experimenter and said, in precise words, "He may be dead in there," and then they pressed the next switch. One teacher, a man named Fred Prosy, was recorded saying, and I'm reading directly from the transcript, "I can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man in there. You hear him hollering. He's hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happened to him? I mean, who is going to take responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?" The experimenter said, "I'm responsible for anything that happens here." Fred Prosy paused, then pressed the next switch. He heard the words, "I'm responsible for anything that happens here," and something released inside him. The moral weight he had been carrying, the weight that was making him sweat and shake and laugh that strange laugh, transferred. Not disappeared, transferred. To the man in the gray lab coat. Milgram called this the agentic state, the psychological moment when a person stops acting as an autonomous individual making choices and begins acting as an agent of someone else's will. The moment when the question shifts from, "Should I do this?" to, "I was told to do this." This is the moment that explains more of human history than any other psychological concept ever identified. Milgram ran 24 variations of the experiment over 2 years. He changed the location, moved it from the prestigious Yale campus to a rundown office building in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Obedience dropped from 65% to 47%, still nearly half. He moved the learner into the same room as the teacher, visible, present, real. Obedience dropped to 40%. Still 4 in 10. He made the teacher physically hold the learner's arm to a shock plate. Obedience dropped to 30%. 1 in 3 people would hold a stranger's arm against a metal plate and press a button they believed was sending pain into that arm, because a man in a gray coat had not yet told them to stop. And when Milgram ran the experiment in Germany, in Spain, in Australia, in Jordan, the numbers were the same. In some places, they were higher. This was not a German problem. It was not a 1960s problem. It was not even an American problem. It was, and this is Milgram's own conclusion, written in 1974, and it has never been successfully challenged. It was a human problem. I want to take you out of the 1960s now. I want to take you out of New Haven, Connecticut, out of the gray lab coat and the shock machine and the clinical language. I want to bring you somewhere you've been. You've been in a meeting where a decision was made that you knew was wrong. Not wrong in the way that criminal things are wrong. Wrong in the quieter way, the way that slightly damages someone, the way that's unfair, the way that serves the people at the top of the room at the expense of the people who aren't in the room. And you said nothing, not because you didn't know, because the person running the meeting had authority. And in that room, in that moment, you entered the agentic state. You became an agent of someone else's will. The question shifted from, should I say something? To, I was not asked. Fred Prosy heard, I'm responsible for anything that happens here, and the weight transferred. You hear it differently in your life. You hear it as, this is above my pay grade. You hear it as, I'll bring it up in my next one-on-one. You hear it as, I'm sure they've thought about it. You hear it as, it's not my place. These are all the same sentence. They are all the 4 prods the experimenter used. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Rephrased in the language of corporate culture, of social politeness, of not making things awkward. The Milgram experiment didn't end in 1962. It has been running continuously, in every office, every institution, every hierarchy on Earth, every day since. The shock machine is just less obvious now, and the gray lab coat has a different dress code. There is one variation of the experiment that Milgram almost didn't publish. In this variation, there were 3 teachers in the room. 2 of them were Confederates of the experimenter. Both Confederates refused to continue at 150 volts. They said they would not go further and sat quietly in the room. Obedience among the real participants dropped from 65% to 10%. 10. 2 people refusing to continue was enough to unlock the conscience of 9 out of 10 people who would otherwise have gone all the way. 2 people. Not a revolution, not a policy change, not a formal protest. 2 people quietly saying, I won't go on. Earlier, I asked you to hold a question. What would you have done in that room? Most people who read about the Milgram experiment are certain they would have refused. Studies show that 90% of people, when told about the experiment, say they would have stopped well before the maximum voltage. Milgram thought so too. Before the experiment. The cruelest discovery of the Milgram experiment is not that 65% of people obeyed. It's that almost none of them knew they would. Milgram spent the rest of his career trying to understand what he had found. He called it the most important scientific work he had ever done. He also said it was the work that disturbed him the most, because what it suggested was not that people are evil. What it suggested was almost harder to accept than that. It suggested that evil, in its most common form, is not chosen. It is drifted into, one small compliance at a time. 15 volts, then 30. The decision to go from 0 to 450 is never made. Only the decision to take the next step is made, and then the next, until the next step is 450. Milgram called this the incremental nature of destructive obedience. No one decides to become complicit. They just keep continuing. Think about something in your life that you have continued with. Not necessarily something dramatic, something small, a situation that you knew at some point had become wrong, and you kept going because you had already come so far. Because stopping would require explaining why you hadn't stopped sooner. Because the next step was just 15 more volts. The Milgram experiment didn't discover that human beings are capable of harm when ordered, that we already knew. What it discovered was the mechanism, and the mechanism is not hatred, it is not indifference. It is the perfectly ordinary human need to keep moving forward, to not create conflict, to trust that someone with more authority has already made the hard decision, so that you don't have to. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not a conclusion, not a verdict, a question. In Milgram's two Confederate variation, the one where 10% obeyed instead of 65, the only variable that changed was that two people quietly refused. They didn't argue. They didn't make speeches. They didn't report the experimenter. They just stopped. And 9 out of 10 people followed. So here is the question. In the rooms you are in, the meetings, the decisions, the quiet moments where the dial is being turned, are you the 65%? Or are you one of the two? Stanley Milgram died in 1984 at the age of 51. Heart attack. He never stopped thinking about the experiment. In one of his last interviews, he was asked, "After everything you found, do you believe in the goodness of people?" He said he did. He just no longer believed it was enough. My name doesn't matter. But now you know something you cannot unknow. What you do with it, that part is yours.